Hello everybody, welcome now to Chapter 7. So in Chapter 6 we studied about some of the diversity that occurs across the world of microorganisms in terms of what their requirements are to be able to growth. And we began to talk a little bit about metabolism, the sum of all of the chemical reactions that take place inside cells. And so now we're going to continue that story in more detail in Chapter 7. We're going to be taking a closer look at how cells are able to obtain their energy and building blocks, how they harness that energy, and then ultimately how they use those things to create their own cell parts and so forth in order to be able to survive and maintain themselves. And so the first topic here, we're going to again reintroduce metabolism and that concept, and then we're going to talk in more detail about enzymes. You hear about enzymes all the time in biology, and so we're going to have a little introduction on those here. Hopefully you've had that in some of your other courses already. So we've taken a look at this diagram before. So we've already described metabolism as the sum of all the chemical reactions that take place inside a cell. And those can be divided up into catabolism and anabolism. And hopefully you guys remember that catabolic reactions are breakdown reactions. So you take bigger molecules like large food or nutrient molecules and you break those apart into smaller building blocks. That's catabolism. And because you have chemical energy stored in the bonds between the atoms in these molecules, when you break them apart, energy is released or liberated from those molecules. And a big part of metabolism is harnessing some of that energy for the processes that cells need to do. And we also talked about how some of that energy gets lost as heat, and you observe that every time you start getting overheated from exercise. That extra body heat is coming from the extra catabolism of food molecules going on in your body, and especially in your skeletal muscles. Or maybe you've built a compost pile before. Have you ever seen a steaming compost pile before? A compost pile is basically a lot of catabolism going on. Microorganisms are breaking down the waste from your yard or your kitchen, and as they do that, energy is released, and a lot of that energy is released in the form of heat. Okay, and then on the flip side over here, you have all these building blocks, these breakdown products. Those are building blocks for biosynthesis. So all cells have to synthesize their parts and replace their worn out molecules and so forth. And so building blocks get linked together. Amino acids get linked together to build proteins. Sugars get linked together to build carbohydrates. Fatty acids and glycerol get linked together to build triglycerides, so forth and so on. That story that you always hear in biology. All of those things are anabolic chemical reactions. Anabolism, that's building. And notice building reactions require energy input to make them happen anytime you build something. A couple of other terms you should be familiar with: endergonic versus exergonic. This suffix here, ergonic, refers to energy. Endergonic means energy input. Exergonic means energy released, like energy is exiting. And so catabolic reactions are generally going to be exergonic, because as you break apart larger molecules into smaller pieces, in general energy gets released. So they're exergonic reactions. Endergonic reactions, your anabolic reactions that take place in cells, are generally endergonic. You've got to use energy, have energy input in order to make those happen. So those are some other terms that you should be familiar with. And I like this diagram too. This is a little bit more of a detailed look at what's going on inside cells and how catabolism and anabolism are linked. And so instead of starting from larger food molecules like larger carbohydrates, larger proteins, and so forth, this is showing you catabolism and anabolism starting with a glucose molecule. So glucose is a monosaccharide. That's the preferred sugar nutrient that many living things prefer to use for energy. And one of the main stories here in Chapter 7 will be learning how do organisms take something like glucose and harness the energy from it and do that in a maximal type of way. But breaking down glucose, and glucose is a combination of carbons and hydrogens and oxygens. They're just not drawn in on this diagram. But as glucose gets broken down through catabolic reactions, that yields energy. Energy is released. And here we see the names of some processes that are used for glucose catabolism. And no doubt you've heard of these processes before if you've had your biology 201 class or if you took a freshman biology class. So we'll be taking a look at these processes that cells use for glucose catabolism a little bit further. All right, and the idea there is, why are we studying that? Why is that important? Why do cells catabolize glucose and other nutrient molecules as well? So these molecules have energy stored in them, but that energy needs to be captured and then restored in a more useful form. And that useful form is ATP, adenosine triphosphate. That's the reusable fuel molecule of cells. So what cells do is they break down nutrients like glucose, energy gets released, and then they use that energy to take ADP, that's adenosine diphosphate, and phosphate molecules and link those together to form ATP. So here you're taking two smaller molecules, adenosine diphosphate and phosphate, you're bonding those together to make adenosine triphosphate. So we just talked about catabolic and anabolic reactions. What kind of reaction is this, where you're taking two smaller molecules and sticking them together to make a larger one? Hopefully you're thinking anabolic. All right, in order to do that, do anabolic reactions give off energy, or do they require energy input? And hopefully you're thinking energy input. Anytime you build something bigger from smaller parts, you've got to put energy in. Okay, where is this energy coming from? This energy is coming from breaking down nutrients like glucose. Tearing those molecules apart releases energy. Okay, so when you take an ADP and a phosphate and stick those together, you are storing energy in that chemical bond, that covalent bond that has formed between the adenosine diphosphate and the phosphate molecule when they get bonded together. All right, and then as we'll see as we go through this story in this chapter, when you do anabolism, when a cell is performing these anabolic reactions to build all of its cell parts, you got to have energy input to make that happen. Well, in general, cells, the preferred way for cells to release energy to do this type of work is to take ATP and split it apart. So you go back and you re-break that bond between the ADP and the phosphate. You break those two back apart, and that gives off energy that is used to power anabolism. So anabolism includes taking little smaller precursor molecules or small building blocks, organic building blocks, and combining them in different ways to make things like amino acids and sugars and nucleotides and fatty acids. And then we've already learned about how amino acids are your building blocks of protein. Sugars are building blocks of carbohydrates. Nucleotides are building blocks of RNA and DNA. And then those things can be bonded together to make things like peptidoglycan. Remember, that's what a bacterial cell wall is built from. It's a combination of carbohydrates and peptides, chains of amino acids. So you have all of these complex types of organic molecules that get bonded together to make bacterial cells, or any other type of cell for that matter. Not just all these processes occur in all living things, not just bacteria. All right, here's another look at ATP, our fuel of life. Very important type of molecule. And as I was just describing, these ATP molecules are constantly cycling. So you take ATP molecules, they're built by taking the two smaller molecules, adenosine diphosphate and phosphate. When you see a P with an I next to it, that stands for inorganic phosphate, which is really a phosphorus atom in the center and surrounded by oxygens. That gets bonded together to make an ATP molecule. That takes energy to make that happen. The energy to cause that to happen comes from all those catabolic reactions breaking down your nutrients. Then ATP molecules can get broken back apart to release ADP and phosphate, and that gives off energy. That energy is used for the anabolic reactions that a cell needs to perform to take simpler molecules and build more complex molecules from those smaller building blocks. So you can kind of think about ATP as being like a rechargeable battery. So ADP and phosphate get bonded together to make ATP. It gets broken back apart to release energy for the cell to use. Then energy from breaking down nutrients bonds those two back together. They get broken apart again. And of course, this is going on in gazillions and gazillions of ATP molecules across your body, or even in an individual cell. This is happening with a mind-boggling number of these ATP molecules that are used. Here's another diagram, a little bit of ATP trivia. Here's another diagram which is showing you in more detail what an ATP molecule looks like. So 1, 2, 3, those are the phosphates that make up the adenosine triphosphate part of the molecule. Then down here, here's ADP, adenosine diphosphate. If you guys remember from back in chapter 1, adenosine refers to the adenine nitrogenous base linked to the ribose sugar. Those two things together make adenosine. Then here's a phosphate by itself, a phosphorus atom surrounded by 4 oxygen atoms, sometimes called inorganic phosphate because that's an inorganic molecule, doesn't have carbon in it. And a lot of times that is abbreviated a P with a subscripted lowercase I. But just some kind of trivia with ATP molecules. So and looking at it from the human perspective, it is estimated that at any given moment in an average human body, there are 6 times 10 to the 22nd power ATP molecules, or that's a 6 with 22 zeros, whatever that number is. And then here's something interesting. Your body burns 6 to 9 times 10 to the 24th power ATP molecules in a day. So 6 to 9 with 24 zeros after it, whatever number that may be. But keep in mind that these ATP molecules are reusable. So an ATP molecule gets split apart, and then energy from catabolizing nutrients can be used to put it back together. So it's not that you're burning these and they're going away permanently. They're reusable, like a rechargeable battery. And interestingly, if you could siphon all of these off and weigh them, they would actually weigh about the same as your body weight, believe it or not. So, and it's the same thing for even a little single-celled microorganism. They're going to be creating and using, recreating, reusing ATP molecules constantly in very, very large numbers. But hopefully that emphasizes the importance of ATP molecules to living things. All right, so that was just an introduction to mainly ATP and its importance in linking catabolism and anabolism. And in the next video lecture, we're going to focus in more on enzymes. So enzymes are these molecular machines that force all of these important chemical reactions to happen inside cells. So we'll talk more about those as we move into the second video lecture.